with all the avenues of portraying ourselves in a sense through social media, through our work relationships, through our parent life, through our interaction with our siblings, through our interaction with our children, right? We wear many, many different hats, and there's a lot of different pressures around each of those labels that we take on. And sometimes we focus too much on that projected authentic self, and we exaggerate or under-exaggerate or pretend to be something that we're not because of those two selves being in conflict. But again, it's that conflict piece that tells us the story on the inside, says, hey, this is that conflict. What is the real self and what are the barriers? And that involves a lot of vulnerability. Maybe I do want to send my kids overnight to their grandma and grandma's house so I can have a break because I'm at a breaking point. And to give yourself the permission to do that is probably a piece of that real authentic self. The projected authentic self says that parent's going to be there. They're going to be like this superhero, which I don't know. I haven't met a real one in real life.
Unrealistic. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And it's actually healthy for you to be able to give yourself and your spouse that time.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Because there's a relationship hat that we're supposed to be wearing. It's like we become, partner and partner, spouse and spouse, husband and wife, whichever you identify with. And we want to say, I'm going to be the best husband there is, but then all of a sudden it fades into the background as we have these other roles that take priority sometimes. So.
And I love your example. So the projected self, right? So I immediately think of social media, right? And for me, this is a personal experience for me. Before I will put any sort of profile picture, et cetera, I have to make sure that I look the best that I can, right? It's got to be the best angle, and I want to make sure I have on the right outfit, right?
Right.
And that's my projected self, because the truth is, if you catch me on a Sunday and I'm at the store, I don't have on makeup, I'm in sweats, and we're lucky if I brush my hair. So
it's completely comfortable. Right. That's what I'd call that.
Which is also healthy, right? It's also part of my authentic self, but it's a vulnerable self, right?
It is.
I don't look like I'm ready to take on the world, right? With all my makeup and whatever that means, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
And that's not to say that we shouldn't be careful with what we post, to social media sites and things like that too, right?
Yes.
Because sometimes there's some boundaries around what we can portray as our authentic self and what's okay. It doesn't mean it's a projected self. It just means that this is the self that I'm okay with the world finding out about, right?
Yes.
But not all pieces of ourself do we need the world knowing about, right? To be successful. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I think in terms of us both being in a professional realm, right? That is a lot of the time what we are once we walk in the door, right? That is our projected self, right? That's the hat we're wearing.
Right.
But all those things are still part of who we are, right? All those other things, being a parent, right? All of those things, the spouse, all of those pieces, the Naranan member. So I think it also filters in, it kind of buttresses, right? Who we are, our authentic self, and our professional self. So
right. And it's okay to be vulnerable in those roles, right? I'm vulnerable as a leader to a certain degree, but when we're working with discovering our true selves, it's important to have a clear idea of what that is, right? And that's when we know our real authentic self, is when there's a clear idea, when we're kind of like, I think this is how we should do this if I'm a husband or a dad, right? I think I should, run over, play hide and seek 24/7, I guess. I don't know, whatever it is. That's what we were doing last night. And that was tiring. Dad was tired after a while.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, and for me as a mom, so my children are both much older, right? And so the role has changed and all the expectations of what mothering means, right?
Sure.
And I often don't know either what that means. And I feel vulnerable in that. I feel vulnerable in, should I be doing this? Should I be texting and reaching out to my children who are old enough to not have to tell their mom where they are, right?
Right.
What does that mean? And if I let them know that I am questioning these things, does that make me look vulnerable as their mom and as that authority figure, if you will, right? Because that's always been my role, the hide and seek, right? All those things. But that's changed dramatically. And so, very vulnerable.
Right. Sort of changes from this healthy obedience to this healthy independence. And that means we have to let go of all control, and that's scary.
Oh my goodness.
Ooh, yes. Not quite there yet, but
work in progress.
Right. Vulnerability and empowerment, right? So we talked about vulnerability and authenticity and how, obviously what we just talked about can be at conflict sometimes. So, but how can vulnerability be empowering, or does that even belong together?
Oh my gosh, I believe so. Because for me, like I said, several life experiences, right? One of the things that I often share, so I was a non-traditional college student. And when I came back to start earning my post-secondary education, I felt very vulnerable, right?
Sure.
I've been out of education for 17 years.
Wow.
17 years.
A lot of things to relearn there. Yes.
Yes, felt very, very vulnerable. But me starting to discover and ask some of these questions about the things I was learning was so empowering for me, right? And now here I sit, right? The therapist on the podcast having these conversations. And so empowering to be vulnerable in that space. But there were certain things I had to admit, and maybe not out loud, right?
Right.
Maybe internally to myself, maybe by way of my work, the papers I was writing, etc. But I admitted, what I was learning and the discovery within myself and education and the world, right?
Right.
And so that vulnerability allowed me to become extremely empowered.
Yeah. So in a sense, vulnerability can build confidence, and it's always an uncomfortable experience because
definitely
you don't know what people are going to do with some of that vulnerability as well, and that's a scary thing as well. So there's lots of fear that's involved in that, but vulnerability can also not be empowering as well, right? It has this build-up effect, right? I could either build on confidence, or all of a sudden someone takes that vulnerability and uses it against me. That can be a very scary thing, and it builds this evidence that I'm not going to be vulnerable because it isn't empowering, right? So it's almost like the opposite is true in that regard. But taking those brave first steps, like you were talking about, LaShawna, helped you tremendously, right? And I can say too, like, I took on this leadership role, before this role, and I talk a lot about that now because I think I gained a lot of experience from it. I remember going into my supervisor's office and being like, I'm not competent for this. I don't know what I'm doing, right? She's like, we wouldn't have asked you to do the role if we didn't think you knew what you were doing. So, but it can feel like that, right? And then asking for help and setting proper boundaries around it is helpful too. But we can also develop a ton of armor around it. And I think Brene uses that word too, armor around our vulnerability so that we're not our true selves.
Yeah. I am the queen also of allowing the wind to be taken out of my sails. And as I kind of began with when we started this discussion was, when I'm vulnerable, I have to decide, right, when and where and how to reveal that.
Right.
And in instances when I do, I generally build myself up to that projected self, right? And even with my vulnerabilities. And so from there, if I don't meet that expectation maybe of what I project that I should be, or I hear something from another individual, right, that takes the wind out of my sails, so to say, then it's not empowering. And I struggle, even though I get up here and I talk a very good game about being empowered and being my authentic self, I also have a very hard time with allowing things to defeat me.
Right.
And remembering that it is me that's allowing that, right?
Yeah.
And so that's when it's not so empowering to be vulnerable.
I know we take on that catastrophizing or that all or nothing thinking and say, since this went poorly, everything's going to go poorly.
Yes.
And
I'm a failure.
And I'm a failure and I'm not good enough and all that dialogue, right? So lots of fear. And I think the fear that comes from vulnerability is just that, right? It could go wrong. Being in a relationship is one of the most vulnerable things you can do. And we work with relationships almost on a daily basis, and we know that clients really struggle with becoming vulnerable again after that trust has been defeated, in a sense, right?
Yes.
And that's because we have what Stephen C. Hayes would call is a problem-solving, judgmental, and analytical mind, right? We're constantly looking for the next problem that's coming our way and how to solve it and how to overcome it, right? So it's like we're in a forest surrounded with bears, and that's just where we live, right? And so the first time LaShawna goes out and she's out of the cabin and she sees a bear and she's like, I'm going to poke the bear, right? Because that's what LaShawna does. She just pokes the bear.
Good at it.
Right. Just poke. Yeah, right. Bop it on the nose. It turns out the bear turns around and gets kind of mad at her, and the bear's like, I'm gonna take LaShawna down. And LaShawna's like, oh no, you're not. And so she fights the bear the first time, right? And then gets her butt kicked and has some scratches and a hospital visit, and but she lives in the environment with the bears, right? Now she's built some evidence that fighting the bear doesn't work, right? So this time she's going to go out and she sees a bear and she runs back to the cabin and she's safe, right? And that, again, builds evidence, right? That says, hey, I'm going to use the analytic part of my brain to draw from this evidence pile. And bopping the bear on the nose didn't work, so I'm going to run from the bear every time. But little do we remember that sometimes we're farther away from the cabin and things like that. So right. I think being vulnerable is that complex, right? And we use, for good reason, that evidence pile that we create to try to overcome those fears we face, because we're wired for protection and reward. Yeah.
Yeah, and being vulnerable, we don't talk about this enough, but it's part of the human condition because of some of the things you talked about, right? We try to prepare, we try to plan for all this stuff that life has for us. Well, can't really do that, right? Because when you least expect it, there it is, right? And so that makes us vulnerable on a whim at a moment's notice, right? We don't know what's happening. And so, absolutely.
It's scary. False evidence appearing real. I heard that once. I don't know where I heard it from, but it makes sense when we talk about fear, right? Because it is false evidence. It's telling us that maybe I just got to stay inside the cabin because that's the safest place to be, right? And then no bears will get me, but little do I know that I have to go to town to get food and, so on and so forth, right? So it's maybe not the best answer. And that's where sometimes vulnerability can be hard to do again, is because I have all this evidence that is so real that why would I ever even try to be vulnerable again? And that means let's break it down. Let's go little baby steps at a time, right?
Absolutely.
To get there. Because no one says you have to jump in with both feet all the time and, do a cannonball right into vulnerability, right? That's what I tried to do at this meeting, and it didn't work. Like, vulnerability, here we go. I'm going to show them how I know how to be vulnerable.
And that's a great example, too, because, yes, in my Nar-Anon experience, right, I didn't share for a very long time.
Right.
So I didn't run and cannonball, as you're saying, right?
Right.
But I did eventually, right? And it was baby steps. I waited for something that I felt was maybe not as intense, if you will.
Sure.
And so while it did take some time, right, I did do it. And so, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's the pathway to growth, right? Vulnerability. We can't grow unless we're vulnerable. Because we're trying something new and we're growing. It's different than, I used to do hiring and things like that in my last role. And one of the things that always seems to be like the cliche thing is if they have lots of experience, then they're certainly going to be good. Mm-hmm. But someone once a mentor told me that if they've worked for 20 years and had the same experience each year, like they've had 20 years of repeated equal experience, they're not growing. You'd rather have that newbie that's fresh off the college graduation stage and than that one that's had the same year of experience over and over again, right? Because vulnerability is the pathway to growth, and without it, we can't grow. And I can tell you some of the most vulnerable things that I've been through have been some of the most wonderful, even though they sucked, they were not fun. I look back on them and boy, that's where I grew the most.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I agree with you 100%. Those things sucked. They were the hardest things, right? And when you're in it, it's miserable and you think, why is this happening to me? How did I get here? Right? You do all that stuff. You do all this questioning, right?
Right.
But then, when you're on the other side of it, oh my gosh, look how far I've come.
Right.
And I think the beauty about vulnerability is through our growth with it, then we can then share with other individuals and how we relate and how we build a connection based on that.
Right.
Especially for us as therapists, right? To be in that space with an individual who is in generally a very vulnerable point in their life, whatever that looks like.
For sure.
And for them to share it, right? They're scared, they're hesitant for all these reasons we've been discussing. But then for us to reach out and say, you know what, I understand that, or I've been there, or, I've known somebody, right? And to connect with that individual, and then to see them be able to grow as well. Just amazing, beautiful pieces also of the human condition.
Yeah. It's those bridges that we can build to different alternative realities that are healthy for us, right? That don't have to be the same reality over and over again. We can move out of that cabin in the wood with all the bears around it, because that sounds terrifying.
Yeah, I'm not going
But it's a very real thing for people, right?
Indeed.
It is. We joke about it, but it is real. There's lots of trauma that can be related to that too. And make it really hard for us to jump out of that protective state, right?
Absolutely.
And be vulnerable to try something new.
Yes.
Speaking of growth, now's the time we got to talk about our goals.
Oh.
Ooh, how would you do this week?
Of course I get to start because I didn't do as well as I would have liked. So on my first goal, right, so I wanted to read more. I will say that I did start. So I completed the first book. I started the second book.
Nice.
I didn't expect to, but I did. And I read the preface in chapter 1. Ooh.
Well, hey, you can determine whether you'll be engaged or not now, right?
And I actually, yes, from that, I love it.
Oh,
so
amazing.
I'm excited about that.
So it's better than that first book you chose. It's kind of like, I don't know if I like this. You stuck with it, thankfully, but I don't know if that's thankfully or not. But now you're into the next book and kind of
so
building evidence.
Yes, there you go. On my assertion goal, not so much. I don't feel that I really did by my measurement or standards. Right, there weren't any experiences in this past week that I can say that I asserted myself more. So I'm going to have to, go ahead and say that I did not accomplish my goal in that area. But I am still working and seeking those opportunities.
Right. What's one thing you can challenge yourself to do by next Wednesday when we do this again, or next Tuesday when we do this again?
What can I challenge myself to do by asserting myself? I would say I am speaking in front of groups a lot more. And so I just need to assert myself in the sense that when I get into those spaces or rooms, whatever they may be, I just need to, again, believe who it is that I am and remind myself of my training, right?
Right.
And that
I'm
will be
prepared.
And
because you were wildly prepared earlier this week for a presentation, because I seen the PowerPoint and everything, and it went well. So,
well, thanks. So maybe just asserting myself is going to start by me introducing myself as a licensed social worker, right? Reminding myself, hey, you've earned the credentials to do this. Yeah. There's a reason why you were asked to speak to this group,
right.
So that could be a piece of just where to start that.
Sometimes our headspaces are in different spots too, so we're not prepared for the amount of vulnerability that we need in the moment, and we need some feedback from a colleague or something like that, and we try to do that here and in our roles here. But also to you as a listener, right, as if you've struggled with something or you didn't accomplish your objective, right? I think there was only one thing I accomplished last week in our goals, and it's about failing fast, right? That's a trendy thing right now that's going on. Like, fail fast and learn from it. And let's try something different, right? Because if something doesn't work, and try something different. So my goals, of course, physical well-being. So I can say that because of LaShawna, I exercised twice last week, right? It's not my three, but it's work.
Baby steps. Yeah.
That's right. And I've made my breakfast and packed my lunch every single day so far. So that's been good. And I did, I think, 3 of the 5 days I've done meditation, and that's gone well. This morning I didn't.
Yeah, have you seen
but
that? That's improved your mood to start the day when you were able to do that.
It does. It does.
Okay.
So I alternate from doing a calming one, a daily calm, and I do a daily focus as well. And it's made a difference.
Awesome.
I sit down at the beginning of my day, and I think it does make a difference. But I hardly have enough data yet to know. So, of course, my skeptical side of me says, well, why not just skip it? Because, you make it through every day otherwise, right? Not a good attitude. And sometimes we do need to check ourselves. Be like, all right, I need to do an inventory right now and understand that I can do it. I am making baby steps and making some progress as a result.
Yes, there you go. Yes, and I can attest to that. Yes, Josh and I have exercised a couple times, and he is doing great on the food. I tease him often about, because I do not eat healthy at all. So I often tease him by eating unhealthy foods in front of him as he has packed his healthy food. So you get an A for the day for being the healthy eater.
All right.
Yes.
All right. I've been authenticated by my coworker. Yes. And sometimes we need that too, right? We share a lot of vulnerabilities with each other, and then authenticating the work and the progress that we're seeing. So, because vulnerability is the pathway to growth. So that's all for today. Join us next week as we discuss the stigmas around mental health. This is Josh.
And LaShawna.
Stay authentic, well, and empowered.